A couple years ago, I installed a cheap security camera in my apartment. Nothing fancy, just one of those small indoor cameras you can connect to your phone. I mainly bought it because my landlord kept letting maintenance workers into the apartment when I wasn't home, and I wanted to know when someone came inside. The camera sat on a shelf in my living room, pointing toward the front door and part of the hallway. After a while, I stopped paying attention to it because nothing interesting ever happened. The footage was always the same, me leaving for work in the morning, coming home at night, maybe the occasional maintenance guy stopping by. Eventually, I forgot the camera was even there. About 6 months later, I had to travel for work for a few days. The trip wasn't planned very well, and I ended up leaving my apartment in a rush. I packed my bag, locked the door, and drove to the airport without thinking about anything else. The first night I was gone, I got a motion notification from the camera. At first, I didn't think much of it. My landlord sometimes entered the apartment for inspections, so I figured it was probably just that. But when I opened the camera app, the video showed something strange. The video started with the front door opening slowly. That part was normal. What wasn't normal was that no one walked in. The door just opened halfway and stayed there for almost 30 seconds. Then it slowly closed again. I replayed the clip 3 times, trying to figure out what I was looking at. Maybe the door hadn't shut properly when I left and the wind pushed it open. But my door opened inward. Wind wouldn't be able to pull it open like that. I tried to forget about it and went to bed. The next morning, I checked the camera again out of curiosity. That's when I noticed another motion alert from around 3:14 a.m. I opened the video. The living room lights were off, so the camera had switched to night vision. Everything looked gray and slightly distorted. At first, the room looked empty. Then I noticed movement in the hallway. Something was slowly stepping backward into the frame. Not walking normally, stepping backward, like someone was leaving the living room but facing the wrong direction. A man slowly appeared on the screen. He was barefoot, wearing dark clothes, and he was staring directly at the camera. But the weirdest part was the way he moved. Instead of turning around to walk down the hallway, he kept stepping backward while facing the camera the entire time, just staring. The footage lasted about 10 seconds before he disappeared down the hallway. My stomach dropped. No one was supposed to be in my apartment. I immediately called my landlord, but it was early morning and he didn't answer. I spent the next few hours replaying that clip over and over again, trying to figure out what I was seeing. Then I noticed something that made it even worse. The man wasn't actually looking at the camera. His eyes were slightly above it, like he was looking at something behind the camera. That's when I remembered something. Behind the camera was my bedroom door. I checked the camera app again to see if there were any other recordings. There was one more, recorded only 2 minutes after the man disappeared down the hallway. I opened it. The bedroom door slowly creaked open. The camera couldn't see inside the room, but I could hear movement, footsteps. Then the door slowly closed again. No one came back out. I ended up calling the police in my city and asking them to check my apartment. It took them about 2 hours to get there. When they finally called me back, the officer said the apartment was empty. No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen. Everything looked exactly the way I left it. I asked them to check the bedroom. The officer paused for a moment before answering. He said the room was empty too, but the closet door inside the bedroom was open. I told him I always keep that closet locked. There was a long silence on the phone. Then he asked me something I still think about. Do you know anyone who has a key to your apartment? I said, no. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. Because according to the footage, the man never actually entered through the front door. A few years ago, I lived in a small neighborhood outside Phoenix. It was the kind of place where everyone had a driveway camera or one of those doorbell cameras pointed at the street. Most of the time, the footage was boring. People walking dogs, delivery trucks, kids riding bikes. But one night, something happened that still makes me uncomfortable to think about. It started when my neighbor texted me around 7 in the morning. He said, "Hey, were you outside around 3 a.m. last night?" I told him no, I had been asleep. I asked why. A few minutes later, he sent me a video from a security camera. The camera was mounted above his garage and pointed toward the street. You could see his driveway, part of my front yard, and the sidewalk that ran between our houses. The video started at 3:02 a.m. The street was completely empty. No cars, no people. Then I appeared. I was walking slowly down the sidewalk in front of my own house. The moment I saw it, I felt this weird mix of confusion and panic. I knew for a fact I had been asleep at that time. I'd gone to bed around midnight and didn't wake up until morning. But there I was on the camera, wearing the same clothes I had slept in, walking slowly past my neighbor's house. I watched the clip again more carefully. Something about the way I moved looked wrong. My arms were stiff at my sides, barely swinging. My steps were slow and uneven, almost like I wasn't fully awake. Then I noticed something else. My head wasn't moving. Most people naturally glance around when they walk down a dark street at night. But in the footage, my head stayed perfectly still the entire time, just facing forward. My neighbor texted again asking if everything was okay. I told him I must have been sleepwalking or something. But then he sent another message. Watch the end of the video. I played the clip again. At the end of the footage, I stopped walking right in front of my house. Then I slowly turned my head toward his camera and I smiled. But it wasn't a normal smile. My mouth opened wider than it should have, much wider, like my jaw was stretching too far. The video ended right after that. I immediately checked my phone's step tracker and sleep app. According to it, I hadn't moved at all during the night. My phone had stayed on my bedside table the entire time. Still, I went downstairs to check the front door. It was locked. The deadbolt was still in place. There was no way I could have left the house without unlocking it. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was dirt on the inside floor near the door. Fresh dirt, like someone had walked in from outside. I asked my neighbor if he had any other footage from that night. He said he did. Around 3:15 a.m., his camera picked up movement again. This time, it showed someone walking back the same direction I came from. But the person wasn't me. They were much taller, and they were walking directly behind me, close enough that they should have been visible in the first video. But in the earlier footage, I was completely alone. My neighbor said something else too. When he first watched the video that morning, he only saw me. The tall figure behind me didn't appear until later when he checked the footage again. A few years ago, I moved into a small rental house on the edge of town. It was one of those quiet suburban areas where every house had a driveway, a small backyard, and the streets were empty after midnight. The previous tenant had left behind a basic security camera system, and the landlord told me I could keep using it if I wanted. There were 3 cameras connected to an app on my phone. One pointed at the front porch, one covered the driveway, and the third one was mounted inside the living room facing the hallway and back door. At first, I didn't care much about them. I left them on mostly because they were already installed, and occasionally I'd get a motion alert when a delivery driver walked up to the porch. Most nights, nothing happened. But about 2 months after I moved in, the cameras started sending alerts around the same time every night, 2:17 a.m. The first time it happened, I ignored it. The alert said, "Motion detected, driveway camera." I assumed it was just a stray cat or maybe headlights from a passing car triggering the sensor. The next night, it happened again, 2:17 a.m., same camera. This time, I opened the app to check the clip. The driveway looked completely empty. The camera had switched to night vision, so everything was gray and slightly grainy. My car was parked in the usual spot, and the street beyond it was silent. There was no movement at all. I figured the motion detection was just being overly sensitive. But the third night, it happened again. 2:17 a.m. This time, the alert came from the front porch camera. I opened the video. For the first few seconds, nothing happened. Just the empty porch lit by the camera's night vision. Then something slowly moved into the frame. At first, I thought it was a person standing very close to the camera. But the more I watched it, the less sense it made. It looked like the shadow of someone standing just out of view, except there was no one there. The shadow moved across the porch floor slowly, like someone walking past the camera, but the person casting it never appeared. I replayed the clip at least 10 times. You could clearly see a human-shaped shadow moving across the porch, but the source of the shadow wasn't visible anywhere. The next morning, I checked outside. Nothing seemed unusual. No footprints, no signs that someone had been near the house. Still, the alerts kept happening. Every single night, 2:17 a.m. Sometimes the driveway camera would trigger, sometimes the porch camera. Once, the back camera sent an alert showing the back gate slowly opening even though it was locked with a chain. After about a week of this, I started staying awake around that time just to see what was going on. One night, I sat in the living room with the lights off, staring at my phone as the clock slowly approached 2:17. The house was completely silent. Then my phone buzzed. Motion detected. Living room camera. That was impossible. I was sitting in the living room. I immediately opened the camera feed. What I saw made my stomach drop. The camera was showing the hallway, and someone was standing there. A tall figure, completely still, right at the edge of the frame. The camera's night vision made everything look pale and washed out, but I could clearly see the outline of a person. They were facing the camera, but I was sitting only a few feet away in the same room. I slowly turned my head toward the hallway. There was no one there. I looked back at the camera feed. The figure was still standing in the hallway, not moving, just watching. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I grabbed my phone and slowly stood up, keeping my eyes on the hallway. Still empty. But on the camera feed, the figure took one slow step forward, then another. I backed away toward the front door. The camera showed the figure walking slowly into the living room, walking toward me, walking toward the camera. Except in real life, the room was still empty. When the figure reached the center of the room on the video feed, it stopped. Then it leaned forward slightly, like it was trying to look directly into the lens. My phone suddenly buzzed again, another motion alert, but this one came from the driveway camera. I opened the clip. It showed my front door opening and me running outside. The problem was, I hadn't opened the door yet. I was still standing in the living room staring at my phone. That's when I heard the sound behind me. A slow footstep inside the house, right where the camera said the figure was standing. I grabbed my keys and ran out the front door without looking back. I didn't return to that house that night. The next day, I went back with a friend to collect my things. Before leaving, I checked the camera app one last time. The living room camera had recorded another clip at 2:18 a.m. It showed the figure standing alone in the room, looking directly at the camera. Then it slowly pointed toward the front door, exactly where I had been standing moments earlier.